Good evening, everybody. My name is Margarita Mooney Suarez. I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to revitalizing culture by turning education back to beauty and wisdom. I am delighted tonight to welcome our guest, George Harne. George is a professor of music and I think also a closet philosopher and a musician. And he is also the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at University of St. Thomas in Houston. He is formerly the president of Magdalen College of the Liberal Arts in New Hampshire. Now at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, they are beginning an initiative on fine arts that's trying to integrate philosophy and theology with creating culture through starting with a master's in fine arts, master's in creative writing, that is, which will be led by the poet philosopher James Matthew Wilson. If you missed Scala's webinar with James Matthew Wilson, don't worry, you can find it on our YouTube channel, Scala's YouTube channel, that is. There's also a prior conversation between myself and Professor Harne in Scala's book, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts. You can find out about that on our website. And I'm delighted to have everyone here tonight. I'm tuning in to you from the Zephyr Institute in Palo Alto. So let me give them a little shout out. The Zephyr Institute is led by Matt Bauman, and I'm grateful to be their guest for a couple of weeks here in the Bay Area, California. I've presented on my book here, and I have found in the Bay Area a tremendous interest in what we're doing here tonight, George, thinking about the place of culture, art, and music in education. Now, before we get going with some questions, I thought I would tell everybody just a little anecdote about why I'm so passionate about beauty. I was trained in psychology and sociology. That's what I got my degrees in. I don't think the word beauty ever came up in any of my training. And when I was a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, I was organizing a mentorship group for women. I called it Inspiring Women in the 21st Century. And I invited a woman who was actually a clinical psychologist to come speak to a group of faculty and graduate students. And she said that the most common thing she found amongst highly successful or highly philosophical professional women, like the women in the room, right? Women who use their analytical brains all day, that they would routinely come to see her because of a sense of lack of connection to their emotions. And she really thought that there were a lot of highly successful women who were underdeveloped emotionally. She recommended a book, which I read, called Feeling and Healing the Emotions. And it was a book by a Catholic psychiatrist. And he talked about the importance of beauty to healthy emotional development. Lo and behold, maybe a year later, I took one of those character strengths tests. And of course, when I take these tests, I have to turn off my analytical brain because I know how they create these measures and I have all these, second guesses about what it all means and how accurate is this and why is this on a hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it turns out, yours truly, lo and behold, the character strength I lacked, the thing I was the weakest in, was appreciation of beauty. And I thought to myself, what's happened to me? When actually was the last time I went out of my way to go to a museum and look at artwork? When did I stop going to concerts and appreciating music? Why don't I have time to be in nature? And could it really be true that the lack of beauty in my life is holding me back from being fully present and emotionally developed and integrated? And since that time, I've discovered that beauty is important in my life, and it's important in how I educate, and it's important in how I worship God. So I'm here tonight to try to continue this conversation about beauty as an integral part of holistic human development, as a part of education broadly understood as leading people towards wisdom, and as shaping culture, shaping our common life together. We will talk about the fine arts, but we're also going to talk about culture in the broader sense of our shared values and commitments and vision of who we are as human beings. So this is why I care about this topic so much. And I thought, before we get into some of the philosophy and definitions, Professor Harne, George, my friend George, would you share with us a little bit about your own biography and why you think you became interested in being a professor and somebody who writes and talks and speaks and leads other people through beauty to wisdom?
Sure. Thank you, Margarita. It's a great pleasure to be here and have this conversation. And I really admire the work you're doing in Scala Institute. I think I would trace this journey back to when I was probably fifth grade, and I'm a product of public school system in Florida. And in fifth grade, they put all of us on a bus and they took us to the local symphony. And the local symphony performed a number of things that day. They performed the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And for whatever reason, that performance transfixed me. I remember just being completely overwhelmed and sort of taken outside my fifth grade self, which isn't that much there when you're in fifth grade, but I was taken outside myself in a way. I would never have used those words to describe what happened, but it was an incredible experience. And I did notice that not many people around me were having a similar experience, but it was something that marked time. It was a different kind of time. It was a different kind of almost a different kind of reality. I went home and found the classical music station and was bored out of my mind. They were playing mostly lugubrious 19th century German romantic works, and I had no interest whatsoever. But that began a journey. I began to seek out performances and ended up joining the middle school band and studying clarinet, and then through college. So it began in a very practical way. I had an experience of hearing it and experiencing a very powerful work, then sought out the chance to make music. And then as I grew up, I began to ask questions about both the history of it, but also the why questions. Why is this music considered more beautiful than that music? Why is Beethoven considered great, or Bach? What makes it great? And so the history, the culture, the experience, the making, the contemplation, it's all sort of been bound up together. And then as I went deeper philosophically, I came to realize that this really is a fundamental human experience, and we're starved for it. We really are. So I think that's in a nutshell. I think that was the journey.
Well, I bet everybody listening can think of some time, either recently or perhaps as a child, when, as you described, we were simply blown away by something beautiful. Maybe it was a concert, maybe it was something in nature. But I think that this experience of overwhelming beauty is universal to humans. But let's start with that, right? If beauty is part of who we are as human beings, do we need then, as you are suggesting, to take a step back and think about that, right? What is the nature of beauty, and why is it integral to who we are as human beings? So what would you say is the definition of beauty? What makes something beautiful? What is beauty?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's tough to answer. And no answer that I give is going to satisfy. And most of the answers I've encountered, they don't satisfy completely, or even most people. I'll take a place to begin from something Thomas Aquinas said, which is that, and the basic translation would be something like, that which, having been seen, pleases. So there's a sense in which we encounter something through the senses, the sense of sight, and it brings delight. It brings joy. But notice how this is rooted in the senses. This isn't some sort of transcendent or experience. It very much involves the body and the sensory experience, and it involves pleasure. Now, you can imagine this definition being taken as, or this description being taken as the basis for just any kind of experience and that pleases. But I think the context and the intention behind it is something much deeper. So when he writes about in other places about this, and drawing on the larger tradition of antiquity, he talks about beauty having three components, and Etienne Gilson brings this out in his book, The Arts of the Beautiful, that there's a sense in which that which is beautiful, and again, he's drawing on the tradition of Augustine and Aquinas, it consists of a kind of unity. There's a wholeness to it. There's a kind of harmony or consonance. Now, consonance is a sonic word. It's a word associated with sound, but there's a kind of visual consonance or oral consonance. And these are very objective. They're rooted in the object. But then there's also claritas. There's a kind of gleam or a spark. I like to describe it. It's the thing that makes you look twice. You see the unity, you sense the harmony, but as your eyes are passing, you look back and say, "Oh, what is that? What's that red in that picture? Or what is that? What is that over on the side? Or a sound that or a chord or a motif or something that grabs your attention." So these are more like conditions of beauty, but it's clear it begins with our embodied experience. So it's an affirmation of our bodies, of our sensory experience. It's not meant to be ponderous and oppressive and analytical. There's a kind of delight that comes from it. But then there are these elements that have to be present: a unity, a harmony, and then a clarity or gleam or spark. So those are good places to start. And then, of course, other thinkers have taken it in different directions. Plato took it, through Diatemus up a ladder to the good as a path to the highest knowledge and experience that almost makes us more than human. Even Jacques Maritain, he took that idea of that which we see that pleases us and immediately moved it into an intellectual realm. So he immediately took it to a place where we see with the mind, and that you can do that. A Euclidean proposition. We've talked about an elegant solution or a beautiful action. So you hear this language, but I tend to think of those as secondary things. They're secondary to that actual visual, embodied, or sonic experience. So that's a place to start.
Well, going back to the experience that you shared of being a young student in elementary school and going to a symphony, can you relate what you just said to your sense of being overwhelmed at this concert, overwhelmed with delight, overwhelmed, I think also with a kind of curiosity about the experience, right? Because I've had students in this class where, right now I'm teaching this class on humanizing education policy with students who have enrolled in a summer program through the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and co-sponsored with Scala. And so one of them, had asked, is beauty something we think about first, or is it something that we experience? And if it's something we experience, why do we think about it at all? Why not just kind of stay in that experience? But could you tell us a little bit more about the connection between experiencing beauty and thinking about beauty through some experience of yours?
Yeah. So I can go back to that fifth grade experience. And I think in this case, and there's a later distinction that comes in the tradition between the beautiful and the sublime, right? And there's a sense in which the beauty is something that's mild mannered. It's polite. You can invite beauty over to your house for dinner, and you don't have to worry about how beauty is going to behave. The sublime, you let the sublime in your living room, it might break some furniture. You just don't know where it's going to go. It's big. It can be scary. It can be overwhelming. And I think that Beethoven experience was actually probably a little more closer to the sublime. It wasn't so much a spark or the play of light on the water or, something that just kind of engaged me in a conversation. That movement of Beethoven, it was like throwing the furniture around. It wasn't so much a spark as it was a shock, right? It was something that really grabbed my attention. And it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. And going through that first movement, it was like being on a roller coaster for the first time. And so there was a sense in which it overwhelmed and almost took possession and of my mind for the length of that time. So I think there are other kinds of works that won't do that. They might be more mild mannered, if you will, and polite. But I think this experience of beauty, it is something that we experience first. This is how I understand it. It's a bit like the reason is involved, the mind is involved, but it's an engagement with something that is good through the senses. It is something that we experience through the senses, perhaps through the intellect in another form. And then we ask the question why and how. And so it was only later that I discovered sonata form by reading about it. And then I analyzed the structure of that movement that had moved me so much, and discovered there was a beauty of form behind all of that activated it. So I think that's and the way I understand most experiences of beauty, it's a sensory, almost intuitive experience that then we ask questions about later. And sometimes we ask questions about it later because we want more of those experiences. So we want to know what was it that made this what it was. And think of food. What kind of food am I eating that I love so much? Well, I want more of this. I'm gonna order something else on the menu from the same restaurant, or I'm gonna find a similar restaurant. We can use our minds to engage in that way as well, because we want to have those experiences again. So.
Well, I'll just share like my experience when I realized I needed more beauty in my life. I remember going to a sociology conference and sneaking out to go to an art museum because I had made this resolution that I was no longer going to go to academic conferences and lock myself inside of a hotel for 3 days and see nothing. So I snuck out to a local Salvador Dali museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I looked at the paintings and I didn't have that much time. I had 30 minutes. And I got completely wrapped up in this one Salvador Dali painting. And I decided to just sit there and let myself be immersed in this painting. And I think in that experience, as you said, right, in the moment that you're experiencing that, you're not analyzing, oh, this is unity and harmony or consonance or clarity, right? You're not thinking that. The whole point is that you're experiencing something that moves you. But then as you walk away, you continue to chew on that, right? You continue to chew on that. But what, you remember it, you think about it, and you start to think, as you said, well, if that moved me so much, what was it that was moving me? And so part of the reason beauty has become so important in my life, echoing what you've said, is that one, it takes me out of myself. In encountering this material object, I'm also encountering the unity and the form and the beauty of the essence of it while I'm experiencing something that's really human, but also is telling me that there's more to the world than my embodiment. So it's embodied, but it's also lifting me out of myself. And that feeling, I think, is why I felt it was so important for my own emotional development to have more of those experiences of beauty, because so much of modern world tells us to think about ourselves all the time, or maybe I'm just really particularly gifted, or I have a cross of thinking of myself all the time, right? So these experiences of beauty are very personal, yet also really communal. And it's a reminder that the material world has a symbolic dimension that's pointing to something bigger. So when we use the word transcendence, is that what you mean by kind of a transcendent dimension to beauty?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience of you've been in a room and there's been a sound maybe coming from one place, and because I'm a musician, I have to use the sonic examples, but maybe there's a sound coming from a speaker or someplace, and then it makes something else rattle across the room, right? There's a kind of sympathetic vibration that moves, and you can't really tell how they're connected, but there is a deep connection, and one sets off the other. Yeah, there is definitely a solipsistic approach to aesthetic beauty. It can just take you deeper, and you're just seeking one pleasure after the other, and you kind of rack them up. You check off the boxes, and you're just running from one thing to another, and that has deep ethical problems. And I think Kierkegaard brings that up. You become so obsessed with the aesthetic that it becomes a god, and we can talk about that as well, because the aesthetic should be linked to the ethical and the philosophic, I think, in a deep way. But I think in its best form, one thing leads to another. And there's a danger here, kind of in the Platonic tradition, the Platonist tradition, is that, and you see this in a lot of writings, particularly by philosophers about art, And I should just, full confession, some of my best friends are philosophers who work on art. So I know them well, and they're some of my best friends. But it's so easy to skip over the aesthetic. It's so easy to skip over that physical embodied experience, and jump, especially in certain circles, in particular religious circles. It immediately, it's like the true good and the beautiful elevator. You just jump in, you hit ascend, and you go up. And you don't actually look at the art in front of you. You don't actually listen to the music that's being performed. It's all about a philosophical experience, and we don't actually have that. So I tend to emphasize the embodied aesthetic more. But you're absolutely right. That is deeply connected to the person who made it, and it's deeply connected to beauty with a capital B. Maritain talks about this. He doesn't like for us to say that we make a beautiful work. It's that the artist makes a work that participates in beauty, which is an interesting distinction. So there's a sense that there is something greater that's beauty with a capital B, that the beautiful things we experience participate in. And so I think properly understood, we can both enjoy and be delighted by the things that we hear and we can see, but we can also allow them to draw us into something deeper, something higher, and that includes other people. The great advantage of concert halls over private listening in your car or, in the home is that you're with other people. You see other people, and it can break you out of this. And there are other deeper levels of communion we can talk about as well. But I think in its best form, it does bring us into a form of communion with the artist, the tradition, and then this ultimate source of beauty.
Let me pick up on what you said to ask 2 follow-up questions that are actually coming from my students who submitted questions in advance for you tonight. And one of the questions from a student is just to walk us through a little bit more some of the debates about what beauty is. So I want to come back to 2 things. One, the difference between thinkers like Maritain and Gilson, who are speaking from the Catholic intellectual tradition. What are they taking from the Platonic tradition and what are they adapting? And the second question is about beauty as self-transcendence or self-expression, and what's wrong, so to speak, with thinking of beauty. What's wrong with beauty as self-expression? Why is it supposed to be communal or self-transcendent? So let's go to the first question. Could you spell out a little bit for those of us who may not know Plato or Plotinus very well? What's the difference between a Platonic understanding of beauty and that of a thinker like Maritain or Gilson?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I'm going to just skim the surface here. But I would recommend that those participating today and maybe listen today, they take a look at Plato's Symposium. That's a great place to look. There's another dialogue, Ion, which is about kind of the inspiration of the poet. One of the ideas is that, and from Plato, is that we're trying to ascend. We're trying to escape from this very disappointing, unpredictable, often tragic world of becoming, which there are good things that happen, but it's really bad things happen, like Socrates drinking hemlock, right? And wars between Sparta and Athens, and political uprisings. A lot of really bad things happen in this unpredictable world, but there's a realm of being. And there's a realm in which these things do not happen, and that is regular and dependent and unchanging. And in some sense, we long for this. We're wired for this. But it's really hard to get people to pay attention to this possibility within them, and this dimension of reality. And Plato tries to get us to think about these things in various poetic ways, oddly enough. One of them is the allegory of the cave in the Republic, this idea of escaping from the world of shadows into the light and being able to behold ultimately the good and the source of all being. In the Symposium, it's a bit different. The idea there is you begin with embodied physical goods, but there are definitely a means to an end. And the idea is you move beyond the beauty in front of you, the beautiful person or object in front of you, and you want to ascend. And we sometimes call this Diatemus Ladder. We want to ascend the ladder of being and ultimately behold a vision of the beautiful or the good. And I would say that's again a very rough sketch, but that's what I would identify as a kind of Platonist approach. And you see this in Plotinus as well. And this can in the wrong context lead to a kind of degradation of the physical world, or a very dim view of the physical reality, a dim view of the body that has senses, in part because it's hard to nail down with any kind of real precision. And you see this within music. It's hard to judge consonances by the ear. When they get so large or so small, you can't tell, is this really a consonant? What is this? So you turn to the numbers that are underneath them to try to get some certainty, because we want certainty, right? So that's part of this. Now, the Maritain and Gilson, I think Maritain, Art and Scholasticism is a great book. And I would recommend readers who are interested in his thinking on art to start there. He wrote a number of books on it. But this idea of the artist is a humble craftsman. And he uses the example of the people who worked on the cathedrals, medieval cathedrals. I mean, they weren't concerned with signing their name and now how am I going to express myself in this sculpture? And how am I going to, it was really, there was a sense of making something beautiful for the glory of God. And of course they wanted to be beautiful. And yes, it's in some sense, some real sense, it's an expression. They're giving birth to something that's beautiful. But the priority is not the expression of the ego, right? That's not the primary thing. And so but art and scholasticism is very good. And he touches part of the genius of Maritain is that he's open to contemporary art. So he's looking at contemporary artists and composers. And so he's bringing in Stravinsky, right? He's bringing in Cocteau. And that's so he does a great job there, I think, in opening things up. In Creative Intuition, a later book, he tries to think about how artists create, what's going on in the depths of the soul of the creative artist. And in a sense, he creates this large system that involves a world of activities and artistic production, and tries to develop and to bring to light what's really going on in the soul of the artist and the poet. Gilson has a much more modest goal, and he really is focusing on the fine arts. And in a sense, he sets aside much of that larger Platonist tradition, much of what Maritain is trying to do, and just focuses on this question of what about music? What about sculpture? What about painting? What about beauty, the beauty we experience in these? What's behind that? And he acknowledges that there's these other traditions, but his focus, I think, is really helping people understand their own experiences. And so he wrote, for Gilson, he wrote a number of books, but I always think The Arts of the Beautiful is perhaps the best place to start. And then Forms and Substances is a sequel to that. And he applies what he talks about in Arts of the Beautiful to each art. So there's a chapter on painting, there's a chapter on sculpture, there's a chapter on music. And those who are specialists in those fields will notice the limitations of his account. But I think it's a great place to start. So Plato inspires us to engage with the beautiful as a kind of ladder or elevator that we can use to get out of ourselves to this highest, vision of the good. Maritain very much draws on that, while also attending to contemporary art. But Gilson, I think you can tell I'm a bit more favorable towards Gilson. But he gives us some of the basic tools to engage the arts. I will say Gilson is very adamant that it's not about expression. And I think that's where students have the hardest time, because he hits us at the very beginning. Art is not primarily about expression. But if you keep reading, as you get closer to the end, you realize he brings it back in. But his point is that we're so obsessed with expressing ourselves, to your point earlier, it's a kind of almost self-absorption, the art, that historically over the course of human history, that's not really what art's been about primarily. So it's not that it can't be involved in that, but that's not the primary thing.
All right, now comes the challenging part for me, because I'm really thinking on my feet here on a live webinar, but I'm fascinated by what you just said. And I want to retrace what I heard to see if we're getting to like some really crucial points here about embodiment. So you began describing the difference between Plato and then Maritain or Gilson. And if I understood you correctly, Plato's understanding of beauty is that it's a form of contemplation that, like a ladder, sort of lifts us out of our body, right? So the purpose, so to speak, for Plato is kind of a spiritual experience that's disembodied. Whereas for Maritain and Gilson, as I read them, they're talking about our experience experience of beauty as being participating in it, which is an engagement of our body with the material world that also has a contemplative dimension, right? So this is the trick, I think, that there's an embodied and a contemplative, but it's not purely mystical, which is why Maritain goes at length in creative intuition and art and poetry to distinguish. He says that art and music are part of the practical intellect. They're not, properly speaking, part of mystical knowledge. He does believe that there's a soul that has mystical experiences of the supernatural, but this is not what art and beauty are. Art and beauty for him are practical. So this gets to the second point, which I heard you say about, is beauty self-expression? And I heard you trying to say, well, that might be part of it, but it can't be the telos, right? And I think this is where what Maritain and Gilson would say, well, the purpose of beauty isn't self-expression. Beauty, to be actually fulfilling to us, has to have a telos, a purpose that's bigger than self-expression, which doesn't mean it's self-repression, right? But simply, I think to the modern world, and Maritain really goes into this in creative intuition and art and poetry. In the modern world, we've got this idea of our psychology, as he calls it, just blood and flesh, instincts, tendencies, repressed images and desires, memories that are just looking for a way to be freed. And he says, no, he wants to talk about creative intuition, and he wants to talk about the spiritual preconscious, which is where our spiritual being and our embodied being, or our intuition and our doing, are one. And so expression isn't quite the right word for Maritain and Gilson. It's what you said. It's participation in something. And the concern is that my concern is that if our experiences of beauty are nothing more than self-expression, then there's no higher order principles, there's no telos, there's no order to it. So why would beauty as self-expression lead to fulfillment if it's not participating in something? Then it's just an expression that's like letting go of an instinct. And how is that, properly speaking, beautiful? It would just be letting go of an instinct, right? Which might actually be, dare I say, ugly, or desecrating, right? Some of our self-expression might be pretty unpleasant. Right.
Yeah, and this is where you ended here. We can come back to this. I'll try to touch on some of the things you raised, but this whole, not all art is intended to be beautiful. And so I think it's interesting. Maybe we can come back to this question, because I'm thinking of Guernica, right? I'm thinking of these things that are made. If art is that which is made, or it's the disposition of the soul that lets us make things, there are some things we make that aren't beautiful, right? And we can give some examples of those. But you've touched on a lot here. I'll simply say what the characterization of and the way we think about art and today, a lot of that comes from the Romantic period. In the way I'm reading through Dante with one of my daughters right now, and we talked last night about how so much we think about romantic love comes from the late Middle Ages, the romances of the Middle Ages, and people didn't. It wasn't that there wasn't romance before then, but it really was accented in a particular way and expressed in a particular way in the Middle Ages, and it's still with us. In the same way, the idea of the artist as the barnstorming, almost demigod, a Promethean figure, that really comes from, in some ways, the withdrawal of religion, the decline of religion in public life, and so artists, in many ways, kind of filled that void. And we see that today with contemporary. A lot of contemporary art is very political. It's it aims to be philosophical in large part because real political philosophy and other forms of philosophy have withdrawn from the public square, right? But we need to talk about these big questions. So who's going to do it? Well, the artists will, right? So if the prophets and the religious leaders are not really dealing with metaphysics and these ultimate questions, the artists are going to do it. And so you see this kind of, and Wagner would be a good example, Liszt would be a good example in the musical world, these larger than life artists, though even the seeds of this go back to Homer, where Homer is inspired by the muses, right? And there's a kind of mediation between the divine and the human by the poet. So it has an older history. But I think, I think about the really terrible, awful poetry that I wrote when I was 14. I'm so glad it's gone. I'm so glad that it was lost across time, because that poetry was just about self-expression and what it was like to be 14, right? I'm so thankful. But we all know what that's like. You're just sort of throwing what's in your mind and your heart out on a canvas or in a poem. It's not about making something beautiful. It's not about craft. It's not about becoming an apprentice within a tradition. It's just a kind of, I don't know, it's about expression. Now, Maritain talks about engendering. And this is very interesting. So there's a lot in creative intuition, but if I understand him correctly, he's trying to posit something besides Freud's subconscious, where all the darkness kind of lives and the drives and all of these things. And he's saying, no, there's actually another part here that is spiritual as well. It's precognitive, it's pre-rational, but it's the place where we can go to be in communion with nature, with God, with the beautiful, with other people. And for the artist, the one who has that disposition and that training, that communion brings to birth an artwork. It brings to birth something that is a kind of seed that may never be identifiable within the artwork, but it brings to birth something that properly nurtured and cultivated becomes the work of art. But it's deeply spiritual. It's not just expression. It comes from the person, it comes from the artist, but it comes from that artist being in communion with kind of, I don't remember the exact phrase, but there's a kind of secret music of other beings. There's something deeper down that the artist enters into communion with. That communion leads to an engendering, a bringing to birth of the art. So it's related. You can see a bringing to birth is a kind of expression, but it's not the same thing at all. It's coming from the artist, but it's a more deeply communal thing. And I think that's what we're asked to do, even as those who listen and hear. We're asked to enter into communion with the artist in the artwork and to experience it in that way. There's a lot there.
There is a lot there, but maybe I could bring it down to some concrete examples of my experiences and your experiences. Part of the reason that I'm interested in beauty also has to do with a research project I did with young adults who had experienced traumatic life events. And I began to hear examples of people, in some ways, working through their trauma through artistic practices of the body, right? In one case, it was tattoo art, right? In another case, it might have been, working in nature. And I heard about, through people who've done work on peace and reconciliation, which is a whole nother kind of background of mine, like women in Rwanda who can't tell their stories of the genocide, but create objects of art. One of my good friends who teaches painting to people who are incarcerated, right? What are they doing? They're restoring a connection to their humanity. They're rehumanizing after an experience of dehumanization, but they're doing it in a way, right, where they're working through their subconscious and their preconscious through the art of making, right? And in my previous webinar with Makoto Fujimura, a Japanese-American painter, we spent quite a bit of time talking about this notion. So I think part of the reason that I'm not totally comfortable with saying art is self-expression is because then that leaves open the question of, is art humanizing us or dehumanizing us? Right. And I think it's possible there are dangers to the artist. One is the ego. The other is expressing something that harms somebody else in some way, right? We use symbolic things or things we create to divide rather than to edify. And so I think what makes beauty satisfying is a sense that it's participating in an ordered cosmos that is communion, right? So you use this word communion, that when beauty is satisfying, it's because it's an experience of communion, of participation, and not simply a romantic notion of individualism for the sake of individualism. But I would say that Maritain would say that beauty makes us more fully a person. And as persons, we're individual and we're communal. And so following from that, if you're following me here, then sort of a question I have for myself, which comes up in some of my students' questions, is the example I gave of loving a painting and you having this experience of the symphony. Well, you went on to study music and make music. I somewhat feel like here I am, this woman talking about beauty, but I don't really make beautiful things. I appreciate them, but is what we're saying kind of implying that to be fully human, you need to be making objects of beauty? And this, I think, leads into the final section of what I want us to talk about tonight, which is the relationship between beauty and education. So both from the sense of, if beauty is a lot more complex than just like something that gives us a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of enjoyment, one, my students want to know if what you and I, if the perspective we're giving from Maritain and Gilson is true, then what does that say about how we run schools? Because people need to be in some ways shaped, formed to be able to appreciate beauty. And then two, a student who was a piano major in college, piano performance, wants to know is sort of how do you balance the technical mastery needed to make objects of beauty, music, art? How do you balance that with this leisurely enjoyment so that it doesn't purely become about mastering the technique for the sake of the technique, right? Because ultimately the technique is supposed to be for the beauty, right? So those are two really big questions, but just to rephrase them. One, if what we're saying about beauty is that it's objective, that it's participating in something bigger, that it builds on our human nature, but also calls forth certain capacities that need to be formed, what does it look like to educate human persons for beauty and do it in a way that doesn't become overly technical and neglect the leisurely, contemplative, pleasureful side of beauty?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at it, and but feel free to bring back parts that I miss. A couple of things here. I'll try to. My son, I have an older teenage son. He's into aquariums, and he has an aquarium that he established and is cultivating, and it's got fish, it's got plants, it's really grown into something. It's 45 gallons, and we've talked about this often. That he is essentially imitating God by creating this world. He's creating a world, he's making a world, and it's really hard, actually. But he's participating in God's act of creation by creating his own world. If Aristotle's right, and we're fundamentally wired for contemplation, thinking, action, which is sort of acting in the world in some capacity, perhaps moral agents, perhaps in the political sphere, and as makers, then each of us have all three of those within us. And all three of those ultimately come back to God as the source of our being. So yes, in a sense, we are all wired for knowing, doing, and making. But we all know that some of us have more of one of those than the other, right? And as we move, I have done very little creating in my life. I did play an instrument for a while, but most of my experience is contemplating beauty. So I do think all of us have that. That doesn't mean that we're somehow less than human if we don't do all three, or we don't do a lot of making. I think some of us make in different ways. Some of us cook, some of us do other things. We make maybe using more abstract things. But I think that is, we are imitating in some sense. But we're also imitating in a sense that we're usually what this involves is that the making that we all do it in some way, if not every day, is we're bringing order to disorder. We're bringing from chaos into an ordering. And that ordering, I think you touched upon, is bigger than us. It has an objective dimension. And in a sense, if, I'm thinking here of Tolkien, the opening of the Silmarillion, his introduction of how the world was created through singing, the ordering of song, but also in a sense, the fall took place through song. I'm thinking of Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan sings creation into being. The Book of Wisdom, where it talks from sacred scripture, where he talks about God creating the world through weight, measure, and number. There's a real sense in which, by bringing order out of chaos, we're again imitating the divine maker. and that creation itself is fundamentally ordered. So when we enter into beauty, like thinking of Maritain again, and we enter into that contemplation, we're actually contemplating an objective order that is ordered all the way down to the most basic level. There's a medieval author who wrote in the 14th century who said that even the dynamic in the Trinity, the Trinitarian dynamic between the persons, is itself a kind of music. So in a sense, there's music from top to bottom. And Boethius famously talked about the music of the human body, how our soul is tuned to our body, right? And the parts of our body are tuned. And the music of the spheres, the cosmos itself is tuned. So there's a sense in which beauty, either sensory or at a more abstract level, permeates all of reality. And then we can't help but bring order to things. We can't help but make. But by engendering it and bringing it to birth, it can't help but have our own stamp. And if that's by what we mean by self-expression, then absolutely. We're pressing out, if you will, from ourselves, parts of who we are into what we make, right? And it's like someone having a conversation who their primary concern is just to talk. They're not interested in listening. And what we're doing, I wish I could listen a lot more. You keep asking me these questions, Margarita. I have to keep answering them. But I love dialogues because you can just be quiet and listen, right? And so this is how it's wired. If we go to the question of education, the students in our schools and our classrooms, they're coming from that with that same fundamental nature, right? They're wired for knowing, for doing, and for making. And there will be students that we introduce beauty to. Remember, you don't begin with the reflection, with the analysis. You reflect, you expose them to beautiful things. You present them to them, right? And some are going to respond very deeply with contemplation. Some of them are going to respond deeply with contemplation, and then they're going to make as well. And we just don't know, but we introduce it to our students. It's a bit like breathing bad air. You don't even know what good air is like until you breathe it and you go, wow, I can breathe. Or you only eat really bad food, right? And then you taste good food, like, wow. Most of these students and kids, they have no idea really what the goods of beauty are, right? Until we introduce them. There is to go back to one of your other questions, there is a danger of professionalizing it, of making it, you become so caught up in the technique, in the analysis. I was having a conversation with a good friend recently, and we basically talked about how music majors generally don't get to experience the liberal arts very much, because the focus is so much on technique and on performance and production that you really have no time to contemplate. And so it's difficult to cultivate that habit to where you can actually listen for beauty. You can actually listen and contemplate and the whole. And the difference here is the whole versus the parts. That analytical dimension is you're constantly looking at the movement from one thing to another, the part to part, the part to whole. And there's a place for that. There's a place for that. But I think we really have to begin by listening to the whole, then going to the parts, and then returning to the whole. And one hopes that you'll have a more informed, deeper understanding when you go to the whole again, through the analysis of the parts. But this isn't, as a composer that I knew used to describe it, it's not about pulling the arms off the doll and seeing what's inside. You've got to enjoy the fullness and the completeness of the whole. Yeah, it's hard if in some ways, studying music professionally, or as your main focus, it really can rob you of your appreciation of beauty if you're not careful.
Well, we're going to continue on this line of education for beauty. And let me just invite members of the audience to go ahead and submit their questions in the Q&A button. And I will try to get to questions from the audience as well. But to follow up with some of the points you were making and some other questions from my students about what does this look like practically, one great writer who really talked a lot about the importance of beauty and education was John Henry Newman. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on his essay on the Benedictine education, which, by the way, that's a book by, that essay has recently been reprinted by Clooney Media, and I have an introduction to that. So I have some thoughts on that too. But could you tell us a little bit about the Benedictine approach to education and why Newman decided to focus on this?
Yeah, and I want to commend Clooney and all that they're doing as well. And I'm very grateful for that edition that came out and your work in that. Those are essays that don't get enough attention. And so the fact that they put them together in a single text with the excellent forward and afterwards, that's fantastic. Yeah, we're big fans of Clooney. And they also, they've published Gilson and Maritain. I would encourage you to pick up their editions of those authors as well. Yeah, I think, this is a thumbnail sketch, but in that essay that you're referring to, he talks about the 3 stages of the development of the church over time. The first was the Benedictine, the second was the Dominican, and the third was the Jesuit. And he associates certain activities or styles or attributes with each one. So the first one, the Benedictine, is the poetic. The Dominican he calls the scientific, and by that he means he's referring to the Latin scientia, that an organized body of knowledge, kind of like a Euclidean proposition, where it's a systematic discipline with premises and conclusions and orderly movement through that. And then the Jesuit is the active. You're going out into the world. And he says very little about the Jesuit. He says a little bit about the Dominican. He promises that something's coming on the Dominican, but he never got around to it. But the Benedictine and the poetic is interesting for education purposes, for reflection on education, because there's a sense in which, and this ties in very much with our thinking about beauty and the experience of it, that approach involves a high degree of humility. You're not building systems. You're not building worlds so much as you're praying and you're working, and you have a rule of life. You have a rhythm of your day, and you have the most important things in it, and you're not overly attached to some huge earth-changing goal, life-changing goal, epic-making achievement. It's more about what is before me today to do. I'm to pray, I'm to work, I'm to delight in creation. And I think this can be a model for us, those of us who are trying to live more complete lives in this frenetic world in which we live, is that we want to pray, we want to do the work that's been given to us to do, whatever it is professionally or as students, and we need some beauty in there. We need to find ways to integrate the beautiful, because actually beauty is conducive to prayer, right? It can be conducive to being better at the work that we've been given to do. And Newman says that the Benedictine is not lost when you move to the Dominican. It's actually subsumed within it. And even with the Jesuit still has within it the Benedictine, poetic, the Dominican, and those are taken up. So I think we have, for those, some of us enter the worlds of education with these goals of founding and reforming, refounding institutions, or bringing about change that transforms all of society, and that may happen. But most of us, it's interacting with a small group of students on a regular basis and trying to be more human ourselves and helping them become more human. And so that Benedictine image of humility and modesty, a rule of life, even a group like Opus Dei that is very much about engaging in the world of action. Members of that movement have they have a rule of life too. They go to daily mass, they pray. So no matter how active you are going to be in the world, you still need that Benedictine core. I think that's what Newman is saying here.
All right, let me say something. Again, it's just occurring to me in reaction to what you're saying, right? In some ways, the Benedictine, as you described it, is the humble. It's the elemental. It's returning back to basics. And the Jesuit is the active. It's the doing. It's the kind of getting out there, right? And then the Dominican is the scientific. It's the mastery. It's the technical. It's the clear, conceptual, right? And maybe in each of our lives as human beings, as students and professors, maybe we move through these moments in our life, right? Because you said the Benedictine is still present there in the Dominican, but maybe sometimes we need to get back to the elemental, right? And maybe sometimes we're called to be active, but if we're called to the active life, then we're also called to the humble life, right? So maybe the trick in human life is holding on to these moments as part of a unity that we pass through at different moments, and that we need all of them. But I would say that right now, the reason Clooney wrote this, decided to re-release Newman's essay, and the reason I wrote the introduction, is that I think, as you were beginning to describe, we live in a time where people have forgotten some of the elemental rules of life that help structure our time, structure our day. One of the students asked about, how do we live this vision of beauty when we live in a time that's sort of dominated by media and the 24-hour news cycle? And what I have seen with my students, and it's been important for how I understand education, I've given students a book to read in a group that's called St. Benedict's Toolbox. And it just encourages people to make a plan of life. Like, what time are you going to get up? What time of the days are you going to dedicate to prayer and silence? And I've increasingly been telling students, the most important thing to do when you go to college is dedicate some time every day to silence. Turn off all your devices and be in silence. And for a Christian, that means prayer with a devotional text in a beautiful place. For other people, it might mean something different. But this rule of life, as you described it, that comes out of St. Benedict does get recreated in these different ways. But what is St. Benedict most famous for? This very short rule, right? It's really short. And it keeps getting adapted and updated to newer contexts. So I would also ask, and I've thought about this myself, all right, so I'm teaching a sociology class, or someone listening is teaching a medical class. What does any of this have to do with an engineering class or a class in medicine? I mean, are you saying we're all supposed to paint pictures together and sing songs together? Right? What does it mean to bring beauty into the classroom, any kind of classroom? I've thought about this, so I don't mean to be putting you on the spot, but.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent question. And yeah, I think, and we haven't talked about Joseph Pieper very much at all, I think, in this call, but, he would say that he would concur with you. You have to create time for this kind of openness to creation, as openness to being. You just have to make the time. The silence has to be there. And if it takes an hour for your heart to stop racing and you can actually breathe and not so much think as to just be open to being and to really listen. I like taking my small children out in the morning before the sun is fully up, and they, the wet sidewalk, and they're barefoot, and I ask them, I say, so what do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? And just to get them to think and to engage those senses and to really engage with the world. If you're in the middle of a brain surgery, you're not going to pause, halfway through and reflect and look at a painting, right? There are moments where you're given a job to do, and you have to do that work. And but I think what we can do as teachers, and by the way, this is another Newman idea, is that influence is really, really important. It's not just in his work on the rise and progress of universities. It's not just what's in the book or on the syllabus. It's the influence of the teachers on the students in that relationship. That's half of education. So if our students can see us living integrated, full lives, thinking about ourselves as human beings, as full human beings, thinking about them as full human beings, I think that's going to go a long way. And some of those conversations aren't going to happen in the classroom. I mean, if it's a calculus course, and we might be able to talk about the beauty of what we're talking about mathematically, but a lot of this is going to come in that introductory lecture or introductory conversation, maybe the midterm conversation, the end. Maybe you do have a parallel track of readings that you integrate in. A lot of it's going to come from personal influence, but I think that these things can, if we're living or seeking to live integrated, fully human lives that incorporate beauty, goodness, and truth into our lives, that's going to come out directly and indirectly in our teaching and interacting with students. It may be an aside you make in a lecture about something. I remember one of my early teachers said something about reading the Iliad or the Odyssey every year. And that had nothing to do with a larger lecture, but I picked up on that. Or he said he reads, one of the major sections of the Divine Comedy every year. I was like, wow, that every year? But that was more of the personal influence. So I think we as teachers can exert that, and we can invite students to sort of step into our vision of things. And that may be harder in organic chemistry, right? But we encourage our faculty here to always be integrating their disciplines within a larger horizon. And again, this is Pieper and Thomas Aquinas and Boethius, integrating their discipline, sociology. How does sociology fit into the larger circle of knowledge and disciplines? How does it fit? What is sociology's relation to the human person? Just asking those questions of our students will open things up.
Well, I would just say, to build on that, that I bet that if you found the best science teachers out there and the best medical teachers out there, you would see what you described, that one, they are people who themselves embody a kind of awe and enthusiasm for their subject.
Yeah.
I would also say they're probably people who are really good storytellers. I remember visiting my brother at Stanford graduate school for his PhD ceremony, and we went to a presentation by a physicist about the famous SLAC, Stanford Linear Particle Accelerator. And this guy got up there and gave the most hilarious presentation about the linear accelerator. And it was all about particle physics, which I know nothing about. But this guy was a master teacher because he persuaded me that this was exciting and important. And then we drove in a bus to the linear accelerator machine, and it was just like this big shed. It was kind of disappointing. But look, I've never forgotten that, right? Medical teachers. I've said before to engineers, like, if you're teaching a big giant lecture in a state school, I bet the students can tell the difference between whether or not you're teaching it with passion or teaching it with dryness in your heart. So what you're saying and what I'm saying is that the best teachers teach with awe and wonder. And to do that well, I think you and I were both saying you do need to practice the silence and the contemplation and the beauty in your life so that you can give it. And I think then that students in the technical fields will be inspired, right? That their field of study, yes, of course, to be a good doctor and a good engineer, you've got to master those techniques. But you don't want to lose sight of the fact that science and technology can be used to create the human good or to perhaps denigrate who we are as human beings. I mean, we don't have to look too far to look at examples of science and technology divorced from a thicker understanding of the human person. So I believe in a liberal arts education because I believe that people who want to be technical specialists are badly needed, but they need to think about how their technical specialty contributes to the human good. Because if they don't, it's very easy for science and technology to be manipulated. And again, to go back to my students' example and being out here perhaps in Silicon Valley in California for the last few weeks, like, are the forms of popular media we're creating good for us or not? And I have yet to find a college student who isn't pondering that question, who isn't asking this question of whether or not the forms of media they're looking at, the amount of media and the content, is this actually good for me or not, right? So I want to just kind of start to wind down with some of your more practical suggestions about living this at all levels of education and living it in the home. You know, I am blessed to come from a musical family, right? A lot of people in my family make music. They play guitar, they play piano, and they sing. And in a recent class I taught on aesthetics, you know, it dawned on me that nobody could think of a culture that doesn't have music, right? That music is a fundamental part of every culture. So actually, I think music is a fundamental part of relating to different cultures. I sang in a choir when I was working with immigrants from Haiti. I sang in the choir in Haitian Creole. I performed publicly in Paris in a Haitian Creole choir. And it was an experience of cross-cultural diversity. It was an experience of unity. But I wanted to put out there that in my family, especially on, the Cuban side, I come from a large Cuban family. My mom's one of 14 siblings. They're all musical. And in our household, like, we sing for holidays and we sing before meals. And I have yet to find a little kid who isn't ready to sing. And what does that tell us?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be part of everything you said. I mean, it seems to be wired. Children don't stand back when music is playing and say, boy, I wish I knew how to dance. They just get out there and they dance, right? And they sing, and it does seem to be part of that. So for you then, it was really integrated in your childhood growing up in the home. That was the big thing.
Oh, absolutely. It was, my mother plays guitar and sings, and at family get-togethers, there was a time dedicated to the family get-togethers where we would sing together as a family, mostly in Spanish, sometimes in English, sometimes in both. It really didn't matter. But it comes very naturally. And so I would just ask, I was also here in Stanford, my aunt, Josephine Jody Gandolfi, has a PhD in music performance from Stanford and teaches piano. And she's just released another CD that she's produced on African-American spirituals. And so she was saying that she really regrets that elementary schools are no longer teaching music and piano and choir, because it's very good for children. And at young ages, children really gravitate to it, but they're being, in some ways, deprived of music. So I would just say, for the elementary school teachers out there listening, or parents, right? How do you practically integrate beauty and music into childhood education?
Yeah. And there's not an easy way. And I think I have children from 20 to 9, right? And so it was, I think, a little easier. We made certain decisions about television when my kids were small to kind of create space in our family culture. And this was long before the iPod and the smartphone and things like that. I do think I would recommend, I think it's maybe even only a few pages long. There's a little book by Joseph Pieper called Only the Lover Sings. And there's a short essay that's a few pages long called Learning to See Again. And it's a lecture he gave at the opening of an art exhibit. He talks about the inability to see anymore, that we're so overwhelmed in terms of our senses, and it's so heavily, our experience of the world is so heavily mediated by advertising and now digital media, that we don't actually see what's right in front of us. So there's a level of ascesis, of a kind of discipline, a kind of fasting that I think absolutely has to happen in terms of how we spend our time. I'm among a group of faculty members who have flip phones here at the University of St. Thomas, which is sort of funny. We're fasting on our phones, right? So you can call me, you can text me, but that's it. And it's just one way of trying to diminish the distraction. There are other ways, other people have different approaches. But I think we have to come up with creative ways to carve out space for silence and peace. We can't pray if we don't have a level of peace. We can't experience beauty. And it's even something you said earlier about cultivating wonder. That's so critical. We can't let wonder be reborn within us without a level of peace and quiet. Once that's done, I think we can introduce beautiful music and beautiful art. Again, trying to sort of introduce that shock or that spark where we grab their attention, and we bring to birth a kind of wonder about, what was it that I just saw? What was it I just heard? Wow, I think I'd like to see that again, or hear that again, or see something like it, again. And then we go deeper into that. And then we get around to the making, right? Those students who are particularly prone and inclined to the making and the doing, we give them opportunities to do that. But you hope that there'll be a birth of wonder that precedes that. And so I think I'm so grateful. And I should say also my local public library had a lot of classical records that you could just check out. And later in my life, I went and bought a bunch of CDs and gave them to the library just to say thank you, because it was that, and the people at the library who worked there, they had no idea how much it was transforming this little kid's life just to have those classical records there, but make it available. So discipline ourselves, our environments. If we're parents, discipline our homes, so that there's room for conversation, for wonder, for prayer. Introduce beauty. Sometimes it's shocking, sometimes it's more quiet, but we're creatures of habit, so we have to do this in such a way that it's going to happen again and again. Otherwise, you do it once or twice and you forget about it. But introduce beauty in prayer. Introduce. There are 1,000 ways we can bring beauty. Throw out all the kitsch and the third-rate mediocrities, which have a way as Americans of crowding into our lives. But it begins with a kind of clearing house. There's a kind of John the Baptist moment where you have to go in and repent of all and clear the floor before we can build and bring in the good. But it's not easy, and it's definitely countercultural. But teachers should take heart, because these things, you may never be told thank you, but when you introduce these things to students, it's going to have an effect, and it's going to change their lives. So,
hey, Beauty will save the world. I will say that I'm so delighted to have had you here again. I know we spent a lot of time tonight in what Newman would call the scientific, the conceptualizing, the talk of beauty. And ultimately, I think that that scientific is going to help people be active and go do something about this. I want this to be a call to action to do more beauty. But I just want to end with what you were saying right now, to me seems elemental and practical. The reality is that there are a lot of ways to reintroduce beauty into family life and into culture and into the classroom. Through a little bit of singing with your family, through reading picture books with children, through storytelling as a method of teaching any subject, from contemplation and prayer, so that you have a gaze of awe and wonder towards another human being, towards everyone I know with kids has sent them to summer camps this summer to be embodied and in nature and off of Zoom, right? This desire to be in nature, and also the desire to get back to shared experiences of beauty in concert halls. People are longing to go to live performances. People are longing to worship together in church again. So given all that has happened, our isolation, our disembodiment in learning right now, I think the time is now to go back to some of these elemental practices. And yes, there's also a time to think philosophically about why this matters and develop, plans of action to create more beauty. But ultimately, I think that this is intuitive to who we are as human beings. And in some ways, there's a childlike simplicity to this. That I think we all experience beauty as children, and children naturally are attuned to it. So we need to get back to that. And that's why I wanted to do this webinar. That's why I'm teaching on it. And I want to thank you, George, and let everybody listening know that Scala intends to do more on this education for beauty and wisdom, because I do think a lot of people are struggling from the isolation, the effects of isolation, from not knowing how to filter the media. And ultimately, I think that does spill over into our emotional health. And our ability to be present to our emotions, to integrate them into something higher, and ultimately to live a purpose-filled life where, yes, we have self-expression, but it's oriented towards a cosmic order that is objective. It's outside of us, but it touches us and it inspires us to participate and to create, to co-create with God, to use Maritain and others' words, and then to reflect upon that and contemplate it in this leisurely way that Pieper says is like the Sabbath day. Right. And then we have to get up and become the active scientific types again, who are the Jesuits and the Dominicans. And then we go back to the Benedictines.